Let's challenge our limitations and promote our curiosity on education and so much more. This is the No Box Podcast with Dr. T.
Hey, is this thing on?
Hello, everyone, and thank you once again for joining us for another episode of the No Box Podcast. It's my pleasure today to welcome a guest, someone that I've known for most of my career, a wonderful gentleman, Nick Anderson, who I will introduce in a moment here a little bit more. But to give you some context about today's journey that we will take with Nick, really centers around this idea of alignment of expectations, really looking at ways to get everyone on the same page, especially as we, whether it is in higher education, whether it is outside of higher education, we navigate through some really interesting environments that are challenging our own norms and ability to maintain relevance, maintain sustainability, and of course look at ways to grow within our own communities and essentially within our own work and within our own relationships with one another. You know, I've always believed every year that this form, function, and philosophy of education is being tested, and we have to continue to challenge not only ourselves but those teams, those employees that work within our organizations to push their own limits, and to be able to do that with a certain level of balance, because arguably everyone is very busy. Everyone has enough on their plate. So how do we get everyone on the same page, recognizing that everyone is busy, that everyone has other things that they need to be focused on? So how do we get those folks to see similarly the focus, to buy into the vision, and of course to challenge ourselves to move in directions that perhaps may be exponentially remarkable for the organization. So today, Nick is going to join us, and he's author of the book, Focusing Change to Win. He's also the managing partner of the Crispian Advantage, an organization where he works with organizations across the globe and also with higher education institutions to work at getting to that point of alignment. A great example of this for context is, you know, if I ask a member of my team what they expect of me, and they give me 10 things, but I've always thought they've expected 3 things, there's obviously some opportunity there for discussion. You know, why does that gap exist? And if you think about this in a broader sense, from an organizational perspective, and you think about the number of relationships that exist within an organization, misalignment of expectations can truly become a barrier to moving forward in a constructive way. So today I am really excited to have Nick join us and to help us navigate this topic and to have some fun along the way, and I think to challenge one another. So welcome, Nick. It's always amazing to see you and talk with you, and just thank you for your generosity of time, and I know your generosity of wisdom. So good to see you.
Yeah, thanks.
So to kind of start off and give everyone a chance to get to know Nick a little bit, I'm going to give you that opportunity to just give us a little bit of who Nick Anderson is, and really what motivates and pushes you and inspires you to continue the work that you do.
Well, it's a long career, but the main points for this podcast are that back in the late 70s, I got to work with the Huthwaite Research Group, and I was trained as a behavior analyst in sales behavior. And consequently, somebody gave me a call and said, wouldn't you like to do what you really like doing, which is research? And so I joined Huthwaite Research Group to do research into sales skills negotiation. And the particular sales skills we were researching was business to business, sometimes called the complex sale, where many people sell to many people, things like a bow tie. Now, during that period, I did European-wide implementations of sales training along with my colleagues, and found consistently that we couldn't get changes of behavior in certain countries and certain types of organizations. And that led me to think about why is the message not getting through from management about, for example, coaching is a very important part of successful implementations. Consequently, I started to look at an author called John Machin, who now is deceased, and he wrote the book Expectations Approach based on his research in the 60s. Out of that came a curiosity and thinking about, well, how could we apply that to the work that we were doing? And the sort of seminal moment in my career was, and I don't recommend anyone does this manually, is to look at the expectations of an international marketing conference for an APV, which was manufactured systems for dairies, breweries, and bakeries. Their conversations would start with, well, sir, would you like the 200 or the 300-foot oven? Just to give you an idea of the scale of what they were international. So we had a whole group of people coming to Denmark. And one of the things that we uncovered was design primacy. And it's really in a vertically integrated company, who can change the design of something like a valve and for their local market, and suddenly people can't use it in other countries in other applications. That led to a significant change in that organization, and that for me was the seminal moment of saying alignment really is as important as Machin had indicated by his projects and research. And that led me on a journey of looking at the whole problems of training as such, and why it doesn't stick and when it does stick and so on and so forth. And so that from 93 really onwards, the passion has been there to say this alignment issue is really crucial to successful change.
Great. So the journey, what, kind of jumping to this win, what, since 93 onward, what has been that most revealing win or something that's really stuck with you, where you've seen the true value and application of this work, where you've been able to take an organization where there may have been tremendous misalignment, and that has affected their ability to grow, to become more relevant to stakeholders? What's been that biggest win that you've noticed or seen?
Probably the pilot project with the Royal Bank of Canada, RBC, and the work that we did with a steel fabricator called Ginseng Steel, which promoted and prompted us to develop more sophisticated ways of measuring alignment. And out of that came the Turner construction work, when we did a multi-level, multi-month project on realigning expectations across a $680 million hospital project in Sacramento, California.
So taking the conversation now to kind of piggybacking it a bit in the context of alignment off of our first episode, where I know you had an opportunity to listen to Arthur Levine talk a little bit about the future of education, and sort of dug in a little bit to the work that we're beginning to navigate through here at Lewis and Clark Community College, which is reimagining and redefining this idea of access and agility. And agility, as I've done more research on the term agility, it's not used as much as sort of the access agenda or the affordability agenda when it comes to students and when it comes to stakeholder investment into this idea of education. So this idea of agility is truly providing students and stakeholders alike this opportunity or this ability or this platform, perhaps I should say, to navigate through a program, a course, or an entire curriculum, in a way that works much better for them. In other words, it's aligned better with the expectations that student or that stakeholder has. So we're looking at platforms like competency-based education, or a concept called the blend flex model, which allows students to move from a synchronous to an asynchronous to a face-to-face modality because that's going to align with the nature of their environment at that current moment. So one of the challenges with change, and I'm going to cite a comment that you brought up in a previous conversation we had, that 70% of leaders' expectations are either unknown or not understood. So from that context and understanding that higher education is at a turning point to ultimately redefine this idea of agility for students, for stakeholders, how do we get there as a collective educational environment when arguably 70% of what we as leaders say or expect are not quite understood? Where are we missing the boat there, Nick? And what advice do you have for our audience of leaders and just general team members at organizations across this country, whether education or not, to get on that same page?
The first thing that we're talking about existing organizations rather than startups. Right. And organizations like Lewis & Clark have long traditions. And so we're not dealing with a greenfield site. To use a construction term, we're dealing with a brownfield site. And oops, we find that there's a 40,000 gallon oil tank buried somewhere on the site. And that brownfield site means that all the people that we are talking about aligning, from students to staff, have preconceptions, cynicisms and skepticisms about change. So we're dealing with that sort of environment, and even a lot of people want to do a good job. The problem is it the job we need them to do? So the last thing you need is to go into somebody's office to pre-COVID or go online and say, what are you doing? And somebody says, I'm doing what I've always done. And the person says, that ain't what we need to do now.
Right.
So there's a sort of effect. Somebody walks down a corridor or goes on to the next meeting thinking they don't get it. And the person who's being criticized or feels criticized is going, you have to be a mind reader around here. Expletive deleted, of course. And so that's the issue, that making assumptions that everyone gets it, isn't it obvious? You know, we've got this new source of funding, we're going to have a new science building or whatever, and everyone's going to jump up and down and go whoopee. And leaders get very disappointed when they suddenly get this silent room. You know, you walk in and say, well, guys, this is great. And everyone's going, And of course, what they're doing is they're not saying anything until they get out of the meeting, and then they talk to their colleagues.
Yeah.
So it's a respect for how difficult change is. Doesn't mean it's impossible, of course, but it means it's gradual. And people need a sense of consistency of direction to feel more comfortable and trusting that the direction is going to work. So, for example, you know, in the commercial world, we're going to launch a new product, we're going to merge two companies, whatever the big change is. And, you know, it's the rah-rah balloons and hype.
Right.
That really is very discordant, and it's particularly discordant in the sort of usual factors of resistance to change. I mean, you know, what's in it for me? The WIFM.
Right.
What is in it for me? And yeah, I can understand why you want to do it, Dr. T, but, you know, I'm already busy.
Right. Yeah.
So the value case is not there. Some people say this isn't going to work because we tried it before. That's often misinterpretation of the change because of the context in which we're trying to bring the change about. And there's often concerns about, well, does this mean somebody's going to lose their job?
Right.
And that's not predicated on anything you've said as a change leader. It's what people's past experiences has been like. So there are factors of saying, one of the big inconsistencies is, are we being consulted or are we being managed, directed? And one thing that I would put into context for alignment, normally, I say normally, the strategy has been baked. It's
Right.
for whatever reason, this is the strategy. And it could be even regulatory, accreditation based, there's all sorts of factors. This is not up for grabs. And one of the change manager problems is some people use a style which would suggest that we can challenge the strategy and we put more ideas into that. That's the worst thing to happen. So the leaders need to be confident that this is the strategy and how we explain it, and then get into alignment of, okay, what does this mean in terms of what I expect of you and what I think you expect of me? Because that's the two sides of this
Yep.
alignment are so important. And so from that point of view, we then say, now, what we need help with and we need your engagement is how to implement.
Yes.
So what does this mean for you in your role? And more importantly, with competency-based education and the other things that you mentioned about agility, is what is the intra versus the inter expectations? And very often it's the inter expectations that will lead to change failure, because people are normally very comfortable, and quite rightly, because they have a job to do, they work in certain departments. So chemistry works with chemistry, and facilities management, who run the air conditioning which keeps the lab going, they never talk to each other.
Yeah.
And so you have that issue of understanding that. And as change managers, we have to be conscious of big change doesn't work. If we make too big a change for people, they will reject it for the reasons I've highlighted earlier. The critical thing is that it's a living process in change.
Yes.
And we need to be, I've talked to you about this phrase before, radical
Yes.
gradually.
That was my next question, to talk about that. So perfect transition. So talk to us a little bit about this idea, because let's say the vision is to radically change, to bring upon a new model of education. And quite frankly, this is what inspires me. I believe that to maintain a level of relevance, I use the examples with Dr. Levine, and he used the examples as well of like models like Netflix or Amazon, which are truly agile models which allow the user, in our case the student, to access content at their own pace. They can stop, they can start, they can move over. So this this gradual radicalism in the context of change, talk to us a little bit about what that means in the context of knowing there's going to be resistance, knowing that big change needs to happen. But how do we get there when, there is this sort of comfortableness that many of us have, including myself? The last thing I ever want is that extra scoop of potatoes at Thanksgiving, because I've already had 4 scoops of potatoes. But I have another one now, and I have to finish it. So how do we do that? How do we pace it? How do we unravel this gradual radicalism context that you've introduced when it comes to change?
Well, picking up on your Thanksgiving example, change can be gastrointestinally challenging because I'm already full. How much more do we have to do? And I think that the other distinction I would draw is between the technology and the people. The technology allows us all the things that you've been saying, about students being able to choose pace and those sorts of things. That's fine. That's great that we've got that technology. But of course, the computer industry has been plagued with GIGO, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
And even today, the very sophisticated AI models still means somebody's got to put something in, and just because it says it's on Google, it isn't true. So we've got a context about using technology, and students particularly have very different experiences of using technology, from complete comfort to aversion. Many students, of course, are very familiar with their phones and social media and those sorts of things. So when we look at how do we address the student personally in terms of making informed choices about understanding that life can get really complicated for students. You know, one of the biggest problems. I'm based in Idaho, so I worked on a task force with the Idaho state, and one of the problems is the go-on rate, as they called it, which is how many students are going to move from high school into some sort of diploma, certification, degree, whatever it might be. And in that case, the main problem for the go-on rate, because we're such a rurally spread state, was money. I couldn't afford the money to travel to college. This was pre-COVID, obviously. And secondly, I have to work to keep the roof over our head as a family. So, that's the sort of mindset of many students for community colleges in Idaho, or too many, I should say, and overcoming that it's not so much resistance, it's the practicality of what you've just been talking about. And access to internet would be another example. So we've got a whole context there of we have this very powerful technology, and how do we get students to engage with it? And that's the area where leaders are thinking about, well, what can we say reliably are the expectations of students, and what do they think what do they expect of us?
Yeah.
And very often in that sense, the general ignorance, I use it in its literal sense, not knowing, is part of how do we get students to engage when they don't have expectations of us because they come from a formal high school environment and they're now moving into this new agile world. What the hell does that mean? And so creating those expectations, giving students a picture of expectations, and allows them to say, no, that's not what I want, or, that sort of refinement of expectations is a really important facet to get the agility that you're looking for.
And perhaps just based on what you talked about, you referenced sort of the K through 12 space a little bit, and this is one where I've been inspired by a number of our superintendents locally here who I think are beginning to challenge that norm of even what does that high school experience look like, particularly that junior and senior year. And this is a topic that I've always looked at as being critical to the relevance of a community college, that access to that next 2 years. So I'd be curious, maybe just if we're kind of pulling off here, using the driving analogy here, we're pulling off and we're taking this exit to talk a little bit about the alignment between the K through 12 system and the higher education system, and what you notice as perhaps the vulnerability getting in the way of strengthening that alignment of expectations.
Yeah, the problem is discriminating the different student groups.
Yeah.
That come through up to K-12. There are obviously the students who leave me alone, let me get on with it, I'm going to get my degree and so on. So there's that sort of top end of capability, and then you've got different groups who are challenged in different ways. And what I would suggest is for the enlightened principles, a bit like here in Idaho, it's about how can we help students get credits for they're coming out at my granddaughter's coming out at 18, and she's got an associate's degree. Right. But I think the question would be, I would be curious, and this is why alignment, you can't paint everything with the same color. Talking to principals about the alignment challenges, for example, the whole attitude of students that I don't need any more qualifications, to quote one extreme, through to, well, I don't know, I can't afford a degree. There's those elements,
Yeah.
and I would be, and because high schools come from a geographic area, there will be issues of poverty, affluence, and all the other things that go into it. So it's very much an ongoing conversation. It also indicates an example of how pervasive alignment is, because there you've got the people who are providing you with students, which you hope come with the right mindset, to use a generic term, and then you've got the populations at the other end of the pipeline, if you like to use that analogy. You've got the employers. So, for example, I was on the task force for looking at manufacturing companies who took students from different colleges. And I always remember the guy who said, well, yeah, you can train them in welding, but I have to retrain them when I get them.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
So you've got an alignment issue on who are our customers in terms of either other higher education institutions or employers and so on.
So that's interesting, because and I've had this conversation with, a handful-ish of superintendents here who I think are challenging those norms. One of the and I say challenging those norms of what the access points look like from high school to higher education, and even in the context of models like CBE and having high schools really begin looking at a more agile model, especially in that senior year where I know I don't have it in front of me, but I know there are some interesting data that suggests that in that senior year, many students, and this is getting to my question, many students are already ready to graduate by January of that graduation year. So they are sort of wandering a bit for that 3 or 4 months. And we wonder, how do we make that time more relevant? Or are there opportunities? I mean, you refer to what we called in Michigan is the early college model. We have a dual credit model here. We have concurrent enrollment, which is where those high school students are actually engaged with our faculty, and that's one that we've been promoting in the context of providing those high school students with a college experience, which could arguably rival taking a course at a high school, which is still quote unquote arguably a high school experience. So here's my question finally, Nick. Okay, what do we do with those students in these high schools that are perhaps interested in college, but they do not know what they should expect? So in that context of expectations, as I've met these students, well, I don't know what I don't know, or I don't know what I should expect about college, or this is a true one. Oh, you mean there's a community college here in our community? Well, not in your community, but 20 miles away. And they were unaware of that. So it's it just fascinates me that we have, what I like to call young ladies and gentlemen in our high schools or in our communities who don't know what they should expect from that next level to help them move forward in their lives. And I'm curious as to what you think about that phenomenon.
I think there's firstly, you start with yourself, don't you? And you say, what are we doing in terms of outreach and broadly education about the relationship between the student school and the college? And that could be multifaceted in terms of what it's like socially through to what it's like academically. And to have then focus groups of students talking about what they understand or what they feel drawn to from the education process that we put in place. And the problem with expectations of neophytes, people who don't know, is they don't have it. If you ask them, what are your expectations, you're going to get something very global and not usable. I mean, the problem with expectations is how do we generate smarter expectations? And we use SMART as the acronym because it's very familiar to people, but we just tweak it a little bit. So expectations are usable when they're specific,
Yes.
they're measurable, and they're agreed.
Yeah.
And then we have to judge realism, timing, and ethical, obviously, and are they recorded?
Yeah.
And so smarter expectations is where we're aiming for, but it's all within the context that the person that we're aligning, it's a process of, I have an expectation of you, and as you said earlier on, didn't realize that students have so many more expectations than we realized, or whatever it might be. We call them expectation gaps for obvious reasons. And so from a point of view of the student, what do they know and what don't they know? And how can we engage them in a way which is not pedagogical, it's more andragogical. It involves genuine discourse with students. And how you fund and do that with everything else that's going on in the environment is a real problem to solve. But it's a problem that needs to be solved if you're going to move to CBE and all the other things.
Yeah, it's it reminds me a little bit of a project years ago that you were involved in, where we asked faculty, faculty and student alignment. So in a course, and we had I don't remember, maybe a dozen faculty who were part of sort of that pilot, where they asked students what did they expect of me as a faculty member, and then wrote down what they thought those students expected. And it was a fascinating dialogue. And I think, too, perhaps the essence of this—
Humbling would be the word that comes to mind.
Is that can really allow, whether that's a faculty member or even a student who's never been asked that question. Like, I didn't know I had the power in a class that I'm paying for to help shape and clarify the expectations I have. Or if it's a manager and their department. But ultimately for me, and based on what I'm hearing today, is it is ultimately about that experience, and how do we create stronger alignment within that continuum of experience for our employees, for our students, for our legislative leaders in our community, for our workforce leaders. And then ultimately, and this is where, going back to that comment I made early on, where there are so many complexities in relationships, because even across those constituents of students, employees, legislators, or organizational leaders or owners of companies in the area, whether those are small businesses, large businesses, those have different expectations. But then the cutting across those constituent groups, in finding alignment across those groups, can be both challenging and humbling, but I think remarkably rewarding when people start to notice, oh, wait a minute, I didn't know that this was something you expected of us. We can help you with that. We thought you just wanted this and this. And so I think as we continue this journey, of understanding and reimagining agility and access and affordability. We haven't even dug into this concept of subscription pay for college students, where they pay for blocks of time, or they're able to bank credits. So we, going back to the comment you made on the workforce, I think it was the workforce or one of the task forces, I'm sorry, that you were on in Idaho, which really looked at this sort of idea of completion or persistence of students. And that's one of the things that we find and struggle with in education is completion and getting students sort of through the experience. And I think the average completion for a 2-year degree is well over 5 years. And in looking at some CBE models that are pretty strong across the country, these are mostly outside of community colleges, 5 months. 5 months to achieve competency. Now, this gets me to a question that I want to sort of dig into with you a little bit, and then perhaps a little bit more discussion is, around this idea of completion, persistence, and what the expectation is of the outside world. What is your opinion, Mr. Nick Anderson, on hiring competency or hiring for the degree? Perhaps a bit of a controversial question, because it's an interesting dialogue that I am being kind of pulled into across the state, across the country for that matter, which doesn't challenge the value of a degree, because the value of education, in my humble opinion, is critical. However, we've put the educational experience into a box. Okay, and we're said the traditional experience is 16 weeks for the most part. It costs this much. You have this much time to finish. Okay, against this idea that I want to hire a welder. And what if that welder doesn't have a welding degree, but they have competency in the areas that I need them to have competency in? Therefore, they are performing arguably at a higher level than Ken, who spent 2 years getting the degree, against Nick or Mike, who took 6 months, learned what they needed to do, mastered those skills, and now they're working on some amazing projects. So, question, what is your opinion on that? You know, are we hiring competency, or are we still too much focused on hiring the person that has the degree? What are your thoughts on that?
The whole issue of recruiting young people into organizations has matured and to some degree improved. But essentially, how many of the employers that recruit your students are using an interview-based model only? So, and obviously the research now is well established, right?
Yes.
If you rely on interviewing people solely as a part of recruiting people, you might as well toss a coin.
Yeah.
Right. So the whole idea, and it surprises me. I can't remember who it was. I said recently, what psychometric tests are you using in your recruitment process? And you would have thought I'd just spoken Chinese to them.
Yeah.
There's no, the understanding of what goes into one of those tests and why it's useful, not just IQ, but EQ, right? Because you've got a lot of organizations function where you need levels of EQ, emotional intelligence, as well as IQ, which is straight line speed, if you like.
Absolutely.
You know, it's like recruiting people with high IQ. It's like, well, here's a nice V8 engine, 450 brake horsepower. Oh, by the way, we haven't got any brakes or steering.
Yeah.
So you've got a bull in the china shop, in other words. So from that point of view, this is an alignment issue about what is it that many employers are looking for. And if they talk about a degree, you've got to take the conversation to, and what competencies are you looking for in that degree holder?
Yes.
And then I think many organizations like Cummins, Microsoft, you know, the big names, this happened 40 years ago, and it's irrelevant.
Yes.
But many employers for communities college students, of course, haven't had the benefit, nor have they had the time to get competent in recruiting people. And that bleeds into the expectations of the student in the recruitment process, because it feeds back to, you know, if we've got a good handle on what the employer is looking for, we can then create transitions from college to employment. And I use the word deliberately to overcome the stereotype of the degree or the certificate.
Right.
It's really, you know, what do you want from these people? And I would submit that many times, it's a long story, but essentially in England, for many years, we've had national vocational qualifications, and MVQ 1 through 5, where 5 is the highest level of competence, have been well established. But it lent to people, particularly in the more engineering skills, for example, to have sandwich programs. So a period in college, a period at work, and so on. And there were various combinations thereof. But that's where having real dialogue as opposed to just
Right.
promoting what you're doing, real dialogue with employers is so important. But the other thing is there's a tendency to think about alignment as a one-time event, and it's too complex and too agile, if to use your terminology, not to have a process in place that looks at key alignment criteria. The problem that you alluded to is complexity of intra relationships, different groups of stakeholders, and so on. So how do we manage that? And I think really we need to come down to what are the key components that are going to get in the way if we don't align. So we need a process of saying what are the major obstacles to actually making something like CBE work, and get agreement across stakeholders about these components. And that's the start of the alignment process. And then we can talk about different levels of sophistication to the situation, because we learn over time that if, for example, if you take 20 people and you wanted to do an alignment process with 20 people, you do have 340 lines of alignment.
Yeah.
20
exactly.
times 20 minus 20 is 380, sorry. And we've known people in very large organizations try to do this manually, and it's easy to get over 1 million.
Yeah.
1 million lines of communication which you're trying to align. So you've got to be very mindful of what's practical, and you've got to be very focused on saying these are the. I wouldn't recommend, for example, you have more than 5 areas of where you need to be aligned. The complexity of that, because you're trying to make it real, you've got to have a process in place to make sure that you're checking in. Are we reducing the misalignment gaps?
Yeah.
Like, I have 20 expectations and you think I only have 3, and that's real data, by the way, is a problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even though somebody says, "Oh yeah, we get on really well because I have 20 expectations of you, and you think I have 20 expectations." That ain't the problem. The other problem is the other valence that we're talking about.
There was a conversation I had maybe 6 months ago with a student, actually a small group of students, and I asked the question. I used the word expectation. I said, what are your expectations of college? And the answer was, well, I don't want to go to college for 4 years, let alone 2 years. And it started to reinforce this idea that, and then I'm gonna give credit to a former dean, Dr. Michael Sundblad, who spent some time here at Lewis and Clark, who made a really amazing observation that our programs need more on and off ramps. And so to my point of what students said to this idea or concept that Dr. Sundblad introduced to us as we were moving through sort of this work of defining what a new model of agility might look like for Lewis and Clark. It kind of challenges that idea, Nick, that sure, the degree is really important, but let's say a student, and we have programs on campus which a quarter way through or halfway through the program, the students kind of take that off-ramp and they get a job. And so what we need to be able to do, I think, in education is make sure that every one of those exits, so to speak, along a program continuum, there are credentials that student can earn. And then let's say a month or 2 down the road, they can take the exit back onto that continuum to stack that credential onto their current credential. Therefore, perhaps down the road, ultimately earning what we might define as a 2-year credential, and then be able to move on to what we define as a 4-year credential, et cetera, et cetera. So I think to this idea of agility, it truly is listening and embracing what students say they expect and trying to do our very best to align those expectations with our own understanding and expectations as educators. But of course the complexity is, to a point you made early on in today's conversation, is, well, we've always done it this way. So I feel that honor this idea that you are comfortable in doing the work the way in which it seems to be working, but have we considered what those stakeholders, primarily that student stakeholder, expects of Lewis and Clark or of XYZ College or YPQ College? And I think that's the challenge. And there's difficult conversations, I think, that need to happen in order for that work to
I'll give you an example.
Defined. Yeah, go ahead.
Consistently in a lot of my work, I'm coaching managers and executives. And one of the questions which depressingly is not answered very well is, do you know what that person, the people that you're managing, what their why is? And you get, basically, there's not many managers who really understand the why of individual A versus individual B that they manage directly. And it's a bit like with students. I think we need to be really humble and saying we don't know enough about that student's circumstances to then show them the on and off ramps in the journey.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And it's, I'm in Jerome in Idaho, and the college is Twin Falls.
Yeah.
People won't know what that distance is, but it's well over 100 miles.
Right.
And so how am I going to afford the gas at $3.73 today, a gallon? And it assumes I've got access to a vehicle.
Yeah.
So you then say, well, do you have access to the internet? And of course, a lot of people don't, as was proved by, highlighted by the COVID. There's lots of people who didn't, and there's steps being taken to connect rural Idaho on the internet. So you've really got to, if you're going to talk to a student and relate to them, rather than get them to feel you're just talking down to me, you're just a pedagogue telling me what I should and should not do, that's where you get the resistance, rather than having the ability to say, look, here are the problems that a student faces as they try and achieve some sort of qualification and a job, because many of them aren't interested in the qualification, they're interested in a job, and a job that pays more than minimum.
Yeah.
And so I think saying what's the landscape of issues a student faces to completion, some of which will be intrinsic to the individual, some of which will be situational because of poverty, access, and all the other things that I've just illustrated. Yeah. And that alignment and education, that it's okay to say you haven't failed because you can't do the next semester.
Yeah.
It's not a question. Many times it's a question of circumstance. Now, of course, there are people who are not focused and have other issues in mentally that mean completing things is very difficult for them. That's another issue. But essentially, I think it behoves a college to talk openly with students. And now when you come, you'll find that there'll be things that get in the way, like I haven't got any money, I've got to work to keep the roof over my head, and so on and so forth. And depending on your student population, your staff or your student service people should be able to articulate the things that get in the way. And okay, so what do you do when your parent becomes ill, for example, which
Right.
would be common. Certainly, my wife's work in the Philanthropic Education Organization for Women, PEO, many times education becomes interrupted because of caring for an elderly relative.
Right.
And I think that makes us more human rather than sitting in our ivory tower telling you what you should do and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. Well, exactly. I think because you brought up mental health, and I think it and that's perhaps another episode because that's a lot to unravel. But it brings up a great point in that we oftentimes as educators, I think it's in our blood to say we have to continue to change and evolve, and sometimes change isn't necessary. Arguably, I think we're in an environment where we need to be thinking about evolving and growing and sustainability, and the operable word I use often is relevance. Are we going to maintain our level of relevance? But the understanding the challenges of mental health and other variables that may impact a student's ability to successfully navigate through a program is really, really important. And I think part of this work, so if we, yes, we want to introduce new concepts and new ideas, but what are those wraparound services? What are those support systems that we're going to also redefine to take into consideration, the vulnerabilities that arguably all of us face at some level in terms of moving through a program or getting through a chapter in a book because you're a little tired and you just worked, but you really need to get through that. So, I think that from today, we sort of leave with this idea that we serve everybody at a community college. We are open access. We are about helping society, helping communities move forward, grow, and find reward and comfort in that. And so with that being said, what is a final nugget of wisdom? You've got the whole audience here, the Anderson nugget of wisdom that you leave us with today that keeps us thinking about the thinking that we're currently doing about the future of education.
Two words come to mind. One is effective and the other is affective. And a lot of the discussion about new and doing more is related to being more effective. But the relationship with your students, it has to be affective. It has to be emotionally intelligent. And I don't mean that in a soft sense, because helping a student address realities like you're kidding yourself, right? Versus a genuinely compassionate approach about your mum's having cancer and has cancer and those sorts of things. But the keeping attuned to the students that we have in our care is really is an alignment issue. If we talk about the different reasons that people don't go on and complete whatever they've committed to doing, will be well known by a lot of people. More research is being done on these and things like that. That's not the point. The point is we have students who are in their own complexity, their own tension in their world, and if we don't actually connect genuinely with them and encourage them to say, what expectations do you have of me? And this is what I expect of you. And making that a transparent relationship, you will lose students who are on the margins of effectiveness as a student. They struggle, dyslexia, autism, all the other things that we know about, we label. But there's a lot of students who, for different reasons, don't have a bed.
Yes.
They sleep on a sofa. And if we don't know that, what price your agility, And obviously there's lots of students that go through and, tick the box, get the qualification, but don't get a job. So we're dealing with a dynamic which saying, how do we maintain a sense of alignment? And particularly, we now know what we don't know.
Yes.
Because what we know we don't know, we can do something about. What we don't know is just dangerous. And so people will say, well, that's the latest computer application and so on and so forth. And students are going, what the are they talking about? So, I would advocate that within a change, because alignment doesn't occur in a vacuum, and nor are we seeking to align people on everything. That's mission impossible and not very good use of time. So, what do we expect students to stop doing?
Yeah.
You know, what do they want you to stop doing, right? So once we get that as a discourse, we can say, okay, what do we expect students to start doing, and what do they want us to start doing?
Yes.
And then the dialogue is, okay, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. What do we want students to keep doing, and what do they want you to keep doing? And so that dialogue through the contact point being in high school, ideally, all the way through the times that we touch and look after those students, that's got to be the mantra, but it's got to be in a process, not a one-time event.
Well, thank you, Nick. Well, listen, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on today, and I know our audience will be intrigued and I think engaged with our dialogue. I want to thank you again for all that you do to help organizations become better. I also want to remind the audience, Focusing Change to Win is available on Amazon, anywhere books are sold, so check out Nick's book, and you can learn more about the good work that he's doing. Nick, thank you, my friend. It's great to see you.
Good to see you.
And just wish you a fantastic day, and thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone out there, for listening to this episode of the No Box Podcast. Stay tuned for future episodes. Be safe, everyone, and thank you once again for joining.